So it doesn't look like we have anybody else joining us. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. It is 1:33 p.m. I'd like to start us off with a round of introductions. I think at this point everybody in this room knows each other, but just for the sake of doing it, I am Jeff Heron, manager of LFUCG's Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention.
Liz Sheehan, I'm a council member and board member and chair of the PPE committee.
Christina Ellison, I'm the director of programs with New Beginnings Bluegrass.
Erica Dominguez with the Lexington Rescue Mission.
Alicia Burris, Volunteers of America, Mid-States.
Hi, Evan Charles here from Marty Jones, Community Action Council.
I'm Bea Mead, HMI Data Specialist with the Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention.
Eric Evans, Housing Advocate with Independence Place.
Caitlin Dixon, Housing Advocate with the City.
And Marissa Webb with OP.
All right, so our first order of business is approval of the meeting minutes from February 7th, 2024 meeting. Double check and let me know if there would be any corrections or suggestions pertaining to the meeting minutes. We did have to go off of notes instead of a recording, so definitely let us know if there's something that you see that needs to be adjusted. And once you've had a chance to do so, I will ask for a motion to approve.
I'll move.
Is that Christina?
It is.
That's what I thought. It was like one of those things where I could directly see you, so I wanted to confirm.
I'm hiding behind this.
Any corrections? Is there a second?
Second.
Any additional discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? The motion passes. Thank you. Next, we have the new business, and our first item is going to be the results of the 2024 Lex Count. I know everybody gets real eager to get these results, but we want to make sure that they are as accurate as possible, so we do a very intensive data validations process. And I will say, usually people are really excited to know what the results were around our unsheltered count. That's usually the part that's easiest for us to work through after we process those surveys. It's really going to be ironing out things like minor discrepancies with HMIS data quality issues. So we're glad to go ahead and be able to share this with you in advance of our submission to HUD at the end of the month. So as you know, this year's Lex Count took place on January 31st. And typically we would do that in the last 10 days of January in accordance with HUD guidance. And the only kind of outliers that we would have, or I'd like to point out in terms of looking at longitudinal data, in 2021 we did apply for a waiver to not conduct a street count due to very high levels of COVID rates within Fayette County. That was granted. So typically we are going to see that year is going to be a little bit lower since we did not have that street count included. What HUD would usually do in terms of our COC application and any assessment of our unsheltered population is usually just plug in the value from the previous year. Additionally, in 2022, the count was going to be conducted in February, also due to high rates of COVID within Fayette County. We applied for a waiver to conduct that later. So it is going to be a full count, but just conducted outside of that last 10 days of January. So looking at more just broad overview, we had only a nominal overall increase in this year's count. Last year we had 815 persons that were experiencing homelessness, either in emergency shelter, transitional housing programs dedicated to the homeless, or persons at unsheltered locations. And this year we found 825 persons experiencing literal homelessness. So the overall increase is only 10 persons, or about 1.2%. What we're going to dive into is some other trends that we're seeing, because obviously that can sometimes tell us a little bit more about strategically using resources and kind of where the gaps are and where the work is to be done. So first, just a quick note about within that overall population, we saw fewer persons that actually accessed emergency shelter this year, despite having a larger amount of seasonal emergency shelter bed capacity. I think that's an important thing for us to recognize. Yes, it's only a difference of about 12 persons, but we had a significant amount more seasonal resources. We had about a 6% increase in seasonal beds, and we saw about a 2% decline in the number of persons that actually accessed shelter beds. I think that's an interesting thing for us to note, because I think it reinforces the discussions that we've had in terms of some of the barriers that we have to persons accessing shelter, or how adequately some of our existing shelters are able to meet all needs of all different persons within our community. We know we lack a shelter that can accommodate couples that don't have minor children. We know we largely have a system that can't accommodate pets who aren't service animals. And I think we need to continue to work on developing that. I think these results definitely continue to speak to the fact that that is something that needs to be addressed. Also, seeing a similar decline in terms of transitional housing. Last year, we would have had a greater number of transitional beds due to some of the ARPA-funded programs that were in operation. But this isn't solely a factor of those programs going away. The existing transitional housing programs that we have are largely for veterans, and they carried, I believe, about a 63% utilization rate. And that is consistent with what the VA is telling me is being seen on a national level, that a lot of those GPD transitional housing programs are struggling to get their utilization rates up and keep them up. Again, I think this is reinforcing the notion that people want permanent housing. People don't want high barrier programs that provide them short-term shelter. They would much prefer moving into permanent housing that truly meets their needs. Coinciding with this, we saw an increase in unsheltered homelessness, a significant increase. In 2023, we had only 38 persons that were found to be unsheltered, and in 2024, that increased to 82 persons. I think that is consistent with some of the observations that we had in the last meeting of this committee, where some of our enumerators reported finding folks when maybe they'd gone to the same location in previous years and not seen anyone. And we mentioned having at least one location where as many as 10 people were found. That is going to be a 116% increase over 23. Keeping in mind that when we're looking at smaller numbers, it can make that increase seem like a much, much larger increase. To put it into context, about 10% of persons experiencing homelessness on the night of the count were in an unsheltered setting. There are some additional things that I think factor into this. One that I would like to point out is that among unsheltered persons, about 49% of those were individuals who were in multi-person households. So again, acknowledging the lack of a shelter that can accommodate couples. We had resources like the Hope Village, but they did have separate sleeping quarters, and so if persons were unwilling to separate, that might be a reason why they would choose to be unsheltered rather than to come into a sheltered setting that would force them to either be in separate sleeping quarters or separate shelters altogether. Next, talking around some things that we saw with different types of households. We saw kind of a reversal of the trends from 23. In 23, we saw a significant increase in single adult homelessness, but a significant decline in the homelessness amongst families and children. What we saw this year was that there was a decrease in single adults, approximately 7% fewer from 2023. But there was an increase of 56% of persons in families. Again, that number, 56% sounds like a lot, but comparing longitudinally, what this really means after we look at 23 and go back to 22, we're right back kind of where we were in 2022. So that basically we just canceled out that decline that we saw from 22 to 23. And overall households with children made up about 7% of all households. Talking through some of the other populations, we'll talk about chronic homelessness. Chronic homelessness, despite having a slight increase this year and a higher amount of unsheltered persons, the number of persons that self-reported information consistent with the definition of chronic homelessness was actually significantly down. We only had 127 persons who self-reported chronic homelessness this year, which is a decrease of about 22% from 23. That also means that overall only about 15% of persons within our system on the evening of the count reported being chronically homeless. That's significantly below what is usually a national average of around 30%, and usually within our system we're going to see a little bit lower than the 30%, but we're usually going to see it at least probably around 20%. Of note, also, only 29% of persons that were unsheltered reported being chronically homeless. And I think that's kind of interesting. 50% of individuals that were unsheltered had responded that they were experiencing first-time homelessness. So a lot of times, again, there's that kind of notion that people have that those that are chronically homeless are persons that have the most severe challenges with things like mental health and substance use. But what we actually saw, at least on the night of the count, was that a lot of those persons, half, were experiencing homelessness for the first time. We typically do see lower rates of chronic homelessness amongst households. We only had 2% of persons and families that self-identified as chronically homeless. I believe it was, I want to say offhand, one household that actually made up that 2%. And among adult-only households, we would see an amount that was a little bit above our overall population and usually closer to our year-after-year average, and that was about 19% of persons from adult-only households that identified as chronically homeless. In terms of youth, we still have relatively low numbers of youth homelessness overall. But we have continued to see increases each year of the number of youth between 18 and 24 that are experiencing homelessness. It's increased each year since 2020. Again, we're talking about going from 22 in 2020 to 24 in 21, 32 persons in 22, 49 persons in 23, and 55 persons in 2024. So still overall relatively low numbers, but we continue to see a slight uptick. So that definitely does point this out as an area where we need to do a little bit more work, a little bit more exploration and resource allocation. Overall, 6.7% of persons experiencing homelessness in Fayette County on the night of the count were between the ages of 18 to 24. If we went looking from 23 to 24, that would be a 12% increase. The majority of transition-age youth experiencing homelessness were unaccompanied. 49 of those 55 transition-age youth were unaccompanied. Unfortunately, only one of those individuals was found to be unsheltered on the evening of the count. So one thought would be that we need to look for future opportunities. One would be, I've heard that now that several communities have already gotten initial rounds of funding, that the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project funding is a little bit less competitive. They haven't officially released a NOFO or announced when that round of applications will be due, but that would be one potential area that we could look at to try to bring some additional funding for this population. Additionally, we had established in our bylaws a youth action board around 2019 to pursue a YHDP application, but it looks like after a couple times of not getting funded, that the Youth Action Board also kind of just stopped meeting or disbanded. I'm not sure exactly when that happened, but it's something for us to maybe take a look at to see if we would want to reconvene either the Youth Action Board or some other entity to take a look at strategies to address youth homelessness.
Jeff, can I just ask a quick thing? So it's some of the minimal work that I've done with either migrant communities and or trafficking, sex or labor. I would think you'd find a lot more youth under the age of 18. Do you think we're not picking that up because we're just not having access to the spaces that sometimes these kids would be in? Or is that just not in our purview because we're kind of looking at 18 and older? I'm just wondering how we would get at this young youth.
We, primarily if we're going to see somebody who's under 18 who's unaccompanied, that's usually going to be with Arbor Youth. And their shelter tends to be very underutilized. I think they had 4 individuals on the evening of the count, and I know at least 2 of those were siblings who had a parent who was staying at their 18 to 24-year-old shelter. They're really only unaccompanied in the sense that they were not staying in the same shelter facility as that parent. So I think in those kinds of scenarios, I think that is a very difficult population to reach. And that could very well involve kind of a dark figure that we're not necessarily seeing or able to access. Because I would imagine it would be a little bit more challenging to identify those persons. They're less likely to reach out for assistance to be able to navigate the system independently. And if things like trafficking are involved, they might not be, for example, unsheltered. We just don't know that the situation that they're in is a positive one. So technically, if they were trafficked, but they were sheltered, they don't really kind of align with this definition, and we are going to have some challenges in reaching them. But I think that's where, if we think that that's happening in our community, we really are going to rely on those partners who specialize in trafficking to help us devise strategies to outreach and engage those populations.
That might be an interesting thing to just in future kind of, and the reason it kind of pops in my mind, certainly with trafficking, but one of the fatality reviews that we did with domestic violence a couple years ago, and it was a case that happened 6 or 7 years ago, so it wasn't tremendously long ago, but this kid worked at a horse farm, and so he was under 17, he was just living in the horse stalls, like he was working out, so he was unhoused for sure, but definitely not on radar.
Right.
Well, I also wonder if the shelters as they are right now are something that youth aren't really attracted to or look to for help, because it may not be considered as safe a space as, say, Arbor Youth, which, if I understand, this was back in December, Arbor Youth kind of changed the way they administer their program for youth housing, because I had somebody who's 18. There's some age issue that they were changing. Am I wrong on that? Is there something that changed in
one
that?
thing is I want to make sure that we're not mixing definitions of who we're talking about, because obviously if somebody was under 18, the only shelter for unaccompanied minors would be Arbor. So we're really talking about either they're with Arbor or they would be probably in a setting like being unsheltered or in some kind of other housing situation.
I think it was because they were over 18.
And it is largely an agency that I think has a really good reputation in the community amongst youth and providers. But then in terms of operations, the only thing that I'm really aware of, they did increase the number of beds for those 18 to 24, and they shifted away from a night-by-night policy of having folks come in each evening to see whether or not they were able to get a bed, to more of an entry-exit kind of shelter workflow, so that once someone was there until they left or did not return for several nights, they were able to retain a bed.
I remember what it was. The person I was looking for had a disability, and that was they had severe epilepsy, and they said they were not equipped to handle somebody, even a youth, who had a medical need that they couldn't directly address. That's what the issue was.
So yeah, that's something else we'd have to think it through a different lens. But
yes. Yeah. No, I remember what the case situation was now. So.
Just returning to talk through some of this, and then we can definitely have more discussion. Veterans, we saw a 8% decrease from 23 to 24. Again, small numbers. It went from 62 to 57. But what that says is that we are still trending in the right direction. We're still below kind of national averages for veteran homelessness. 0 veterans identified as being in a family. So we're talking adult-only households. 2 were identified as unsheltered, 20 in emergency shelter, and 35 in transitional housing. Again, we have roughly about 60 transitional housing beds for veterans, so we are seeing those resources being underutilized. But this does show that we're maintaining the usage designation for having effectively ended veteran homelessness, in the sense that we are continuing to see low rates for this population.
What was your percent on the beds that are underutilized?
I think that there's about a 63% utilization rate for both Hope Center and St. James GPD programs, at least on the night of the count. And I know it can fluctuate throughout the year, but this is something that we've consistently seen in data as these open beds, different periods throughout the year.
I can't remember if we distinguished between the veterans in the GPD and the veterans in the general population. Do you remember if we did?
So we, in terms of,
Veteran
in
beds.
GPD, there would have been 35
So we
veterans. 20 would have been in emergency shelter, like general population, and then 2 were found to be unsheltered. And this report should have been included in your packet, but after we approve the results and everything, it will be made publicly available, like on our website. I had also included just a comparison of what our seasonal capacity was. You will see in this table or chart that there is a slight decrease in the number of standard capacity or year-round beds. That's largely going to reflect the changes with Salvation Army reducing their bed capacity within the last year or so. But then you'll see that we actually had significantly more expanded or seasonal capacity. As I mentioned earlier, it would be a 6% increase in the amount of shelter beds that were available, but 2% fewer people accessed shelter in 24 as opposed to 23. And it is in here about the veterans. It was 63% of our transitional housing for veterans was utilized. And I think all of this information, the trends amongst shelter, transitional housing, and the unsheltered population all speak to the fact that, one, we need to work on improving our existing shelter system to better meet the needs of all persons. And 2, we need more permanent housing resources if we're going to end homelessness locally, because it's not a matter of us just building more shelter beds and then moving people into housing. The beds were there this year, and whether people were unable or unwilling, they didn't access them. So we've got to continue to expand the strategies around permanent housing. So that was the numbers and trends in a nutshell. Definitely glad to have more discussion, questions. Want us to kind of get the most that we can from this information.
That's a lot of data, really amazing, you know?
And there's more that I'd like to do and plan to do over time. We worried about meeting the HUD requirements first, and then some of the things that I noticed in doing that, but I thought, oh, I want to investigate this to see if this matches up with what I'm seeing in this area, or why might this be. But you know, we'll have a lot of ability to go back through and do some more expanded things. We're reporting a little bit more granular data on certain things like racial categories expanded. What we saw was that as a response to some of those race changes within our system in HMIS, we actually had more persons that self-identified as Hispanic, either as Hispanic only or Hispanic in some other race category, whereas in previous years before the most recent HMIS data standards update, being Hispanic was an ethnicity and not a race. And so as such, fewer people reported it because it wasn't one of the options that were presented to them a lot of times. So that's kind of interesting. We'll have a little bit more granular data around age, so we should be able to do a little bit more in analyzing that. So definitely there's more that we plan to do with this data, but we wanted to, at the very least, cover the ground of everything that's required or gives us the big picture.
Was there a place to write in race? I know that people themselves weren't filling it out. And
So for shelters, it's going to come from HMIS since those are already data points that are collected. But for unsheltered, we did modify the surveys that we used. We do have a little bit of a struggle where if somebody doesn't want to respond to the full survey, it can be a lot more difficult through observation method. But we do try to compare what we're getting from observation to see if it's consistent with like within the percentage of the unsheltered population that did complete the full survey. Are those racial breakdowns roughly similar so that we know if there's a major concern about the observations made?
Right, because I've seen an expansion just in what people report. Also, just by they see that we want to give them more options, but a lot of times they don't fit quite in, so we'll write it in. I know the other day a guy would only identify his race as his religion. I forgot which one it was, and we, of course, he was very insistent, so I took that as his race and then Googled it, and it's an ethnicity, considered an ethnicity. So I felt kind of weird about it, but I put down his race as what I thought he looked like. But I made a note, at least in our database, but there's really not a way to capture that. But I don't know. I guess you have to make a judgment call on every one of those.
Yeah, we're getting a lot more expanded options within HMIS, and it is, when I was processing the results, we were seeing a lot more combinations that wouldn't have been reported to us in the past. Other questions, observations, discussion?
Well, I was just thinking that one of the reasons I think that youth between 18 and 24 that I've noticed homelessness is that I think a large number of them, well, it's not fair, turn down extended guardianship when they turn 18. Do you know what I mean? And then they immediately regret it or regret it soon after. And we've helped at least 2 youth in the past couple of years appeal that. I know Arbor Youth has helped them too. And it's a really tedious process. And I don't guess there's anything we can do about that. But it's a state level thing. It shouldn't be that hard. It was really hard for him because he turned it down. You know, I refuse, is it called guardianship? Extended state custody.
Yeah.
Which is a really great thing to have because they offer you a lot as a young adult. But, you know, I'm free, and they turn it down, and then they instantly or pretty fast regret it.
Well, I think that's definitely something we should keep in mind because at the very least, even if there's not something that we can do to modify the process, we can at least support each other in making that process easier. We can inform each other of making sure that we would have some information or a subgroup that meets to try to collect information so that there's like a toolkit where a provider knows if this is something that somebody wants to pursue, here's some guidance to help you get there, and some of the lessons that maybe you learned when you tried to do it for somebody, somebody else doesn't have to learn the hard way. We can work smarter rather than harder. So I do think that's something that we should keep in mind.
Maybe sometime on a macro level we could lobby to make that not so difficult.
Because I do understand that it might not sound attractive to somebody to have a tie to the state, but then they may change their mind later.
Yeah, because there's a lot of things that services they come looking for. It's like you would already have this if you know, and it's a sudden, you know, kids are impulsive, or at least a extra warning they give them.
We could also, for example, look at within shelters like the Hope Center and the Salvation Army when we're seeing folks that are accessing their shelters instead of a shelter like Arbor's Transitioning Youth Shelter. We can always look at adding additional data collection to find out more about the factors that are involved in their homelessness.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
But I like what you were saying as far as, you know, it's also a matter of how to package to somebody younger. They may not find some of the benefits attractive because of the way it's phrased.
Right.
Because sometimes we can be very clinical about what we're describing to somebody. So having that kind of cool talk with the kids, this is something that's going to really help you because, and not waiting for them to ask you, but kind of volunteering it because otherwise they may not know. I'm all about educating, as you know. So, one of the things I wanted to point out, though, to get back to the veterans, is that any of this report, because I've been learning that veterans are one of the few groups, like with vouchers, that there are no limitations. So is there a number of veterans who are getting more permanent housing versus having to use shelter or emergency housing?
So in general, we do have more resources for veterans, and I think that is why we were able to achieve and maintain that designation. Nationally, there were a lot of resources and funding that were put behind trying to effectively end homelessness for that population. And I think that either at a national level or even at a local level, if we want to see the same kind of improvements in other populations or with the overall homeless population, it would probably take a similar amount of intentional effort and levels of resources.
Yeah.
Within our office, we always will ask, "You're not by any chance a veteran, are you?" Because we know that there would be transitional housing, there would be multiple different forms of permanent housing. There's HUD-VASH vouchers, there's programs like SSVF that can do more rapid rehousing type of assistance.
Right.
There's VET, VETT vouchers. So there's a lot more than we can offer the general population.
Yeah, which is nice, but the other problem is still having that housing available. Having a voucher is only half the battle, and that is finding a place. Which I just want to throw this out there because I just happened to see this the other day. There's a non-for-profit organization they did an expose on TV about called Veterans Community Project, and they're doing this right now in Missouri, in Kansas City, Missouri, and it's federally, has some federal funding. They're basically taking a community and creating tiny house communities that are just for veterans, nobody else, no other demographic. Each are like a single studio type of housing that they have, like maybe 24 in a community. So with also veteran support services and all the rest of that. So I mean, it's just something I'm like, well, why can't we have that? Because it was really nice. And this was just a brand new program that they were talking about. But yeah, I just haven't seen. I was like, okay, well, I'll have to bring that up at one of our housing meetings. But they said it takes about $1.5 million to create and maintain these tiny houses for veterans. So.
And tiny homes are something that's been kind of talked about. There's a lot of opinions about those within our field. I know locally there's been some concern about the cost of land in Fayette County. I know some housing advocates in the state are not big fans because they don't see those structures as necessarily being the best or safest for people long term. They have concerns about like their safety in the event of something like a tornado. But it is something that, at the very least, I believe EHI Consultants, the ones that are doing the affordable housing needs assessment, they're approaching that from the angle of putting out a lot of different options, engaging interest around various different types of housing, and really making sure that they're not focusing on one specific type of housing as the strategy.
Right.
So I'll be interested to see what their recommendations will be once because they've gotten a lot of surveys, really high response rate on those surveys.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, because I think that might be a kind of a good solution for a lot of different things. I know another program in Colorado that it has housing just for youth. They build a building and it's called The Place, where just youth are allowed, and they basically have apartment rooms, studio apartments for youth to stay in while they get on their feet, get jobs, get established, and the state is limited. But it's that more permanent housing that gives them that step up to getting other things accomplished in their lives. So I just keep seeing more and more of that happening in communities around the country where they're kind of like, okay, same thing here. We were talking about, shelters for people with disabilities. There are technically none that fit the bill for somebody who's either in a wheelchair, who has oxygen, who has other disability needs that a shelter can say, yeah, they can come here. So it's just.
I mean, we do have a lot of folks that have some of those issues that are accessing shelter. I think that there's still room for improvement, but I do know that a lot of people, for example, who have been in a wheelchair that have been in our shelters.
We always have 2 or 3 at least
Yeah.
at one time.
I think a lot of times it's assessing what the overall needs are and
Right.
if there's an ability for it to be met. Because I know, like, we talk sometimes about things like oxygen. There's a difference between whether someone's on a concentrator, if there's equipment that has to be plugged in, is there a space where they actually have available that they can put that person,
Sure.
that they're going to have all those needs met.
There's the fire marshal who doesn't want the plug to cross
A pathway.
an
Yeah.
aisleway.
Yeah, yeah.
We only have so many plugs and
Right.
across aisleways and,
Yeah.
it's an issue.
There's definitely room for improvement. I think those are things that we need to continue to look at. But it's going to also be a balance of how much we do need to make sure that there is a emergency shelter option, but we don't want to scale that up to the point that we're investing more in shelter that what our data tells us people don't want to access.
Right. That makes
when
sense.
we could be investing in permanent housing.
Yeah, no, and I definitely agree with that, for sure.
But before, I don't know if this fits exactly in, but before I leave, I want to put in my shot for the medically compromised again, the homeless, medically compromised in general. It's just such a huge issue. I mean, I've talked to someone on the phone today, and these people these men that probably can't get up and down off of a mattress by themselves, they know it's the criteria, but they'll come in anyway and try, and of course I'm not just going to shove you out. Incontinence is a huge issue, and then there's pride, and then there's the fact that we have 2 staff members and 180 guys, and if they're urinating on the mats, how is that for? I mean, that's a daily thing for us, and it's, we do what we can, but the medically compromised is a huge thing,
Yeah. I'm sorry, I missed what organization you
I'm
were
sorry,
with?
the Hope Center.
Hope Center, okay.
And yours?
Independence Place.
Cool.
Yeah, I'll bring you some brochures and my business card.
One of the things that I've made a really intentional effort to do is really network a lot more with our healthcare providers. And I've shared this sentiment in other platforms, so some of you have probably heard from me multiple times. But it still feels like, despite some of those efforts, when we interact with other systems, those of us that do housing and homelessness, usually once that is identified as somebody's need, it feels as if the entire case is handed over to us.
Yes, I see what you
Whereas we are expected on our end to be like, at least have a working knowledge of issues like medical needs, mental health needs, substance use, immigration, and things that tie to refugee status. We're supposed to be kind of like a little wizard or expert in everything, but I oftentimes get a lot of pushback when I try to loop in other systems when there's housing that's involved. And sometimes when we have opportunities, try hard to recruit some of those other systems, and it seems like there's a hesitancy for them to want to, for example, put in proposals for those kinds of programs, because I think they believe that you have to have some kind of specialized knowledge to be a housing case manager, whereas from my perspective, if you're an effective case manager, you know how to assess needs and how to advocate for your client and how to pursue housing for an individual, whether you have a experience as a housing case manager specifically or not. It's good case management skills translate. Most of the time when I was a case manager, I didn't know the answers to a lot of what was presented. It was having the humility to pick up the phone or reach out to someone and say, hey, I'll be honest with you, I don't know this very well. I'm just asking. Anything you can do to point me in the right direction or get me further is helpful. And I think people want to have a lot more confidence in this work, and I understand, but we only have so many homeless service providers, and we have a system and individuals that have multifaceted needs that I think we really need to find ways to make our systems better interact and better work collaboratively. Because can't view it as only one type of issue. It's a whole person.
Right. And then I'm going to shut it back to this, but for instance, today when I was talking to this guy on the phone who through the assessment, we both agreed he was medically inappropriate. I've been in this field forever and at the Hope Center forever, and I really felt like I don't know where to refer him. You know, during the care navigators in the cold weather, I was doing that for a bit, you know, but I don't know where to refer this guy whose family put him on the street. And I mean, if he goes to a hospital, they're not going to keep him. You know, they might see him in the ER. And I just feel super helpless, and it's ridiculous that I have been in this field for so long and I don't know what to tell a guy, you know? And I probably told him to call you guys. I'm sorry.
It's not easy.
I gave him several numbers.
Yeah. You know, there are some things I think that we could definitely share. There was a senior housing navigator that did work with several individuals from the Hope Village, for example, to get into a facility in Moorhead that's assisted living. She's told me that roughly they can work with anyone with an income of about $1,000 a month. They can have an ability to pair people in a shared apartment if they have a little bit lower income. Doesn't have to be a strict definition of the elderly. Sounded like meals and basic toiletries were included. Sounds like their heart's in the right place, but we need more options like that can provide a higher level of support.
Yes.
I think we need to continue those conversations, definitely, because
You
we
said
are
that was
seeing
Hope
more
Village?
complex
He
needs.
was offering that? Hope Village?
No. There was somebody that several folks from the Hope Village had been placed with.
Oh, okay. All right.
And then Carlisle
That sounds interesting.
was that place that was great. I think nobody was in it for a long time, and I think they got burned out. And I can't think of the name of it, but they were really good. A sort of personal care home. They also had assisted living. But
In my dream world, we would acknowledge housing as healthcare, and all the different various systems would come together and contribute their
Yeah.
funds and find easier pathways for people.
But we can't get them to come to this table.
We do struggle there, and we're going to work on that, definitely. Just in the interest of time, making sure, is there other questions or discussion around Lex count? All right, then we would want to go ahead and have a motion for someone to go ahead and approve the results of the 2024 Lex count.
I will make that motion.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second.
All right. Any additional discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? The motion passes. So definitely, I know sometimes the impact of data doesn't happen immediately in the moment. If thoughts connect, let's bring this back to the table in future conversations and make sure that we're continuing to investigate what this data shares with us. All right, so next on the agenda, we would have our fiscal year 23 HUD system performance measures. And I'll turn that over to Marissa, if the rain will quiet down.
Thankfully, I'm loud, so you can probably hear me even with the rain. While the projector is booting up, I think this is a really natural segue for discussing and thinking through ways to improve, room for improvement. These are our system performance measures for the fiscal year. So that means that this is going to be fiscal year 23, so this is October 1st, 2022 to the end of September 2023.
It might be yesterday. Oh my goodness.
Okay. So our system performance measures, I think it's important to remember that while the Lex count provides us a really vast data set about one point in time, our system performance measures are throughout the year. So this is kind of zooming out a bit. If we looked at one day, zooming out and examining not just the number of folks within our system, but also how our projects, how our system is truly performing. And these matter because this directly affects our funding as a part of our COC application, our local competition for HUD COC funding, as well as ESG funding. So this is vital and really important. This is also, as many of the folks in here know that participate in HMIS, our HMIS entry is at the project level. So this is another way that we're zooming out, right? If we're zooming out from one day into a year, we're also zooming out from the project level into a system level. So the first of which is the length of time folks experiencing homelessness occurs. This is going to be it looks like it was printed out of HMIS because it was printed out of HMIS because our current upload system does not have a print feature yet from HUD. So this will be measure 1. The number of folks within our system, the number of folks who are both in the emergency shelter transitional housing, and then expanded into permanent shelter. And you can see that we've seen a slight decrease annually of folks who are accessing our system. And the length of time that folks experience homelessness, looking at the average length of time, is increased for those in emergency shelter, transitional housing, but decreased for those two categories plus our permanent housing. And then our median length of time has increased as well, from 11 days last year to 13 days, 12 to 15 days for those including transitional housing. And then for permanent housing, it's increased 6 to 7 days, respectively, for those two groups. And I think that just really speaks to, especially when we're looking at plus our permanent housing, that really speaks to just how difficult it is to find housing. So, and I think that that's something that we've heard throughout the year, just it getting harder and harder to actually find a place to house folks. So this, I know that the graphs that I provided were very little, so that's part of the reason why I wanted to bring it up, make it look big. That way you can actually see what you're looking at. So over here is 2019 into 2023, which is on this side as well. And then you can see kind of our 4 categories, blue being emergency shelter and safe haven, which is not applicable here, yellow being those in emergency shelter and transitional housing, then green including emergency shelter, permanent housing, and then finally purple, which is emergency shelter, transitional housing, and permanent supportive housing. So if we're looking at it over time, I know that Jeff had kind of stated we're bouncing back to those numbers, and when we zoom in at just a 5-year mark, that's what we're seeing here as well. And then if we're looking at those days that folks experience homelessness, again, the number of days, this is average and then median length of time for those folks, and I think that we can see that while there hasn't been much change, right, those changes have been 2, 6 days, 7 days, you know, I think our highest was about 11 days change. We still see that, you know, with the grand scheme of things, it's still quite little, but, you know, if we're talking about an additional week that somebody is experiencing homelessness because we simply can't find a place to house them. And then our average length of time, which we can see is also quite a bit longer, the highest being 2021, and then bringing it down to 316 days. Measure 2, This is the extent to which persons who exit homelessness to permanent housing return to homelessness. So it's important to remember that this measure is simply looking at the number of folks who have exited to a permanent housing destination, not necessarily return to destination unknown or destination emergency shelter. This is a permanent housing destination. And we have it broken down by within 6 months, within 12 months, and then within 2 years. And that total percentage of returns within 2 years increased 3% to 21% in comparison to last year. And then if we look at that, looking at solely this year, we see that we had 71 folks exit from emergency shelter to permanent housing, with a huge bulk of those folks returning to homelessness in less than 6 months. 51 returned to homelessness in less than 6 months, 31 returned to homelessness within a year, and then 42 returned to homelessness within 2 years. From permanent housing, not quite as big of a discrepancy, with 6 months. Within 6 months, 51 folks returning to homelessness, 42 folks returning to homelessness within 2 years, and then closely followed by returning to homelessness within 1 year. And then from street outreach, with the, again, following very similarly, from exiting from street outreach into 6 months, 1 year, and then 2 years.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
How are you getting that data? So one of our grants actually just asked that question, and we don't follow people out beyond into their permanent house. I mean, we can if they want to,
Yeah.
but we don't always. So I didn't have a good number for that. So, but you all probably have it because you have access to HMIS.
Right.
And so I'm wondering for us
We're
if we should
generally
do
running
that.
system-wide reports that look across our system and are coded to look across all those time frames and all the different system projects. And so as a VSP, it's a lot harder. I would suggest having the folks on your team connect with B, who would be able to work with you. We could do some kind of data sharing or confidentiality agreement, and then look across both platforms.
Right.
Which is something that we're going to be moving toward anyway, since you guys are going to be participating as a direct subrecipient of HUD COC program funding. We already have, as you're aware, had the teams been working on ensuring compatibility of the systems, so that we can have you guys do some reports that we can make sure we're capturing in all of this, and I'm sure we can use it to help you on those kinds of questions.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, at the
Okay,
project level,
great.
because this is pulled system-wide, at the project level, what we would be able to do is just look at those who exited to that permanent housing destination, and then
And see if they popped up someplace
See if they
else
popped up
where we
someplace
would know
else,
that.
that's right.
Or we might not know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, we were just kind of going through like a year's calendar and going, did we hear from Diane? Like, you know, like we were just
Right.
sort of trying to figure
Even
it out.
within HMIS, those reports are built at the system level, and so sometimes it's manually looking at within the time
Yeah,
frame
yeah.
who were the positive exits, and then manually looking for those clients in
Yes,
other
right.
programs.
Yep. Okay. Great.
Well,
That
you
just
talk-
came up today.
While you're talking about that, Marissa, when you were talking about length of time homeless a little bit earlier, does that come from the system? Does that pull it from their actual in-out dates in the system? It doesn't pull it from that question in the entry assessment where they ask you. It pulls from that question?
So some of it does. When it comes to the length of time that persons are in a homeless situation and until they move to permanent housing, that approximate date homelessness started is a factor in determining how long people are homeless. So you definitely want to make sure that you're asking about, as folks enter your shelter, this specific episode of homelessness. Like if they had accessed your shelter in 2018 and you left that date instead of asking and entering in an updated value, it could greatly skew that measure.
Yeah. So we try to update that annually at least. even if they haven't come and gone?
I would say that would be a good idea.
Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes when we don't have those persons moving into permanent housing, it may just be more of looking at what was the length of time that they were in emergency shelter.
Okay. It's hard to work, those questions are worded weirdly, and
Yeah.
I'm trying to,
Yeah, I agree.
Can you describe for me the path that someone went on from exit from street outreach? So is it like this, they were unsheltered and the street outreach team contacted them, and then
Yes.
where
so
do they exit from?
It would be like, for example, if somebody was enrolled in like Lexington Rescue Mission street outreach, and then they were able to house them through HIP or something like that, because I know that they work closely with HIP. They would then exit them from their street outreach project into permanent housing destination. Client has a rental with no ongoing subsidy, or potentially client does have a rental if they received a referral to just a rapid rehousing COC funded project. They received a referral to a permanent housing destination with ongoing subsidy, and then from there that would be considered kind of a positive permanent housing exit. That's different than our permanent housing exit. That's different than a positive housing exit, because street outreach specifically looks at positive exits more broadly than like a housing project would, and that they're also counting emergency shelter or institution stays as a positive exit from street outreach, since the intent of a street outreach project is meeting folks literally on the street, unsheltered, versus perhaps like in an emergency shelter, or if somebody is in transitional housing.
And we usually are going to have fewer overall street outreach exits within a year, because it's not like a shelter where we say that person's physically not here in the shelter anymore, so we're exiting them. We generally keep a time frame of at least 90 days or so that we would allow for someone to remain in that street outreach project before closing them out, because we know that there could be periods where we don't have direct contact, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their situation is resolved.
And our final measure, measure 7, as a spoiler, it is going to look directly at specifically street outreach and those positive exits. And we can see over time that our positive exits have gone down, but we've also exited more folks as time has gone on. So for fiscal year 2023, our exits from street outreach, our exit from transitional housing, and our exits from permanent housing here, we can see a huge bulk of our returns to homelessness is going to be from those who exit from emergency shelter, with that biggest bit being those who have returned in less than 6 months. And this is a trend that, I guess I can bring it back a little. Well, yeah, I'll go here. This is a trend that we've seen over time. I think like last year, our returns was, our biggest returns was actually within the 2-year mark, and this year we've had an increase of 3% within 6 months. Thinking that through, this really seems like perhaps we're exiting folks to a housing destination that may not actually truly be sustainable for them if within 6 months they are returning back to our system, they're returning back to homelessness, rather than within 2 years, in which case that could have been, an external factor. It could have been a health crisis, it could have been a job crisis, familial crisis, family breakdown, something of that nature, versus within 6 months. It's really telling us that perhaps where they're exiting to is not a viable option. It's not actually stable housing.
That's so hard because it's just hard to find places that are sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree.
Sorry, just voiced that out loud.
Yeah. I think like just earlier today and yesterday, we were talking about a unit from a landlord that I know that none of us would probably want to live in that costs like $915. which is a lot of money for a studio unit, and sometimes that's our entire population's income. So.
But then, at the same time, it could take a long time to get into income-based housing
Right.
or get a voucher.
Absolutely.
So I can understand
That's why
people
we do it.
wanting to
Yeah.
pursue a housing option that's more immediate. But is it sustainable, and how can we better prepare people? What life skills can we teach? What case management can we deliver? What income can we increase or generate? We need more tools for people that when they do exit.
Or just more
Percent.
options like for like roommates and stuff, because
Yeah.
I know when like we house them with rapid rehousing, unless they're like a couple, they can't be roommates.
Yeah.
Which, or at least I don't believe they can be unless they're like an actual couple per se. So like if we could house them together, I mean, yes, there's conflict and all that jazz as well, but they could afford better.
And for a different reason, but supporting this, what you just said, I was having a conversation with a long-term client of ours who helps us around the center, but I had the conversation with him today. You need to move on. This isn't right. I mean, you can do, and his issue is, well, a lot of guys' issues that are on disability, they're lonely when they move out. Really lonely. And if you have any mental health problems, this guy has severe diabetes since he was born, type 1, and he's afraid, he's so terrified that he's going to go into a coma when he's living alone. And that's a real fear, you know. And he has been exited by us successfully and just come back because he was so depressed. He ended up in the hospital. And so we're thinking of things. Can you volunteer? And he said, well, we're, you know, depending on if I can get an apartment I afford, you know, he said, I would like to take the bus and volunteer. But I've always thought not only roommates for financial, but we have so many guys that like the companionship of living with other people.
It's true. A lot of our kids end up in the same. They end up sleeping in their apartments with their friends instead of staying at their apartment. Like we had a kid recently, which we never have. We haven't had a kid return to homelessness in a minute, and we had a kid that was in his apartment for maybe 3 months and disappeared on us, and we had no idea where he went. And he just came back to the shelter like 2 nights ago and was like, "Yeah, I got really lonely." I was like, "Why didn't you talk to us?" And he was like, "I just was embarrassed and I didn't think y'all could help me." And so he went back to homelessness and was couch surfing rather than stay in his apartment because he was so lonely. So yeah, no, I get it.
I know from working with our HMIS data that I've seen instances with trying to resolve like systems with this data set specifically of like someone who was in one of our permanent housing programs but then returned to shelter but hadn't actually lost housing. It was just going back to be in that environment that was familiar and where there were others.
Yes.
I think that Jeff, I mentioned earlier, right, the silo that different systems operate within, and the healthcare system currently sees loneliness as a huge epidemic. And I think that especially when you're coming from a congregate setting, whether that's emergency shelter or even unsheltered homelessness, where there is a lot of reliance upon the folks that you consider part of your household to then moving into a household perhaps solo. I think that, yeah, there's definitely some discussion, and I completely agree about the viability of housing when roommates are potentially involved, because it really allows for a little bit more stability.
Is that something the survey will look at when you said they're going to be probably making recommendations of multiple types of housing? You know, kind of when Eric was talking about small, like tiny homes, but shared, you know, like I always think of the house next door to me, which is sober living. And I know we're not necessarily talking about sober living, but I think that really helps that group of 5, you know, like there is one guy there who's,
I just don't know with 100% confidence if that was something that was included in their survey or not. So I wouldn't want to give an answer without going back and looking at it. Just 'cause with that not being in my office, I don't know it as intimately as some of the other stuff that we work with.
I think it'd be a really interesting option when we're looking at housing in totality. Not all of it, but what's a place that's on National Avenue, not Legacy. It's like for women over 55 and they don't really want to live alone and they kind of vet each other. They, is it Legacy House? No. But it's just that. Women that are kind of widowed or living alone, but they didn't want to live by themselves. And so they just group share.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting
And that has
model.
taken hold a little bit more so for some of the older populations,
Yes.
but there's not a reason that we focused a lot on things like scattered site housing, but for example, could there be other forms of housing that should or need to be considered? And does permanent supportive housing need to look like a case manager that comes to your scattered site apartment, or does permanent housing also maybe mean more of a site-based option? I know that's something that a lot of other communities have done and we haven't, but could it be a community where there are shared spaces that when you want to come and be social, you can. When you need support or assistance, you can come, but you can also go back to your individual room or unit.
Right.
So looking at measure 3 is our number of persons experiencing homelessness. This is from our point in time count data. This I should say is from HMIS, and then our graph that we're going to be looking at is from our point in time count data, which is here. So we can see our number once again bouncing back to roughly about 2020, 2019, and then our total point in time count as well. This obviously does not include 2024, which we just discussed, since this is coming from fiscal year 2023. Measure 4, this is our change of income. This is broken down into a couple of different ways. First is going to be the folks who are considered stayers. So these are folks who remain in the project versus leavers, folks who are exiting from the project. And then it's also broken down further within those two categories into earned income as well as non-earned income as well.
An important limitation on this data is that this measure specifically is going to look at COC funded programs, so it's not going to be a representation of the entire system and our ability to generate income. For example, emergency shelters would not be included in this.
So looking at our total number of adults, we had an increase of 2 in our total number of adults with increased income. Decreased 8, so from 23 folks increasing income to only 15 folks increasing income, and that percentage from 31% to 20%. And this is for our system stayers. And then for our system leavers, once again, a decrease of our total number of adults who exited, as well as a decrease of adults who were able to increase their income, and thus that percentage decreasing as well. So income is a place that we've known for a while that we need to work through and work with our various other partners. But I think especially now, when we look at this, these are our raw numbers. So this is going to be the raw number of folks who have increased their income, 15 folks for stayers, 13 folks for leavers, and we can see that that is definitely a decrease for leavers, which is a little bit alarming because if folks are exiting from a project, then we want to make sure that Measure 6 is not applicable for our community, so we're skipping that and moving on to Measure 7, which is our exits to and retention of permanent housing. So this is street outreach. Looking at street outreach first, you can see that the persons who exit street outreach, we've had a huge decrease in the number of folks who have exited street outreach. So from 213 individuals to only 33 individuals, and of the above, those who exited to a temporary or institutional destination, from 23 to 5, And then of the above, of that 213, 33, those who exited to a permanent housing destination was 46 to 11, again with a huge decrease in the numbers of folks who are actually being exited. So that percentage of successful exits is not telling a 100% accurate tale, because we're not fully exiting folks from street outreach. And then I'm going to skip a couple slides but come back to it. Because this is our change in our street outreach exits. So if we just look at a percentage of successful exits, if you want to look over here, this is our percentage column. In 2020, we had our percentage of successful exits be 76%. And thinking through that data set, I think we had like roughly 20 folks being exited at that time, and nearly all of those exits were to that positive or permanent housing destination, which is why that percentage is so high, to 32% last year, where we had several more.
Do you think that was because of like the extra COVID funding and stuff like that?
I think part of it was potentially, I mean, perhaps. I think part of it was just that with the increased number of folks that we're seeing street outreach engage with, just a lot more folks, just potentially not exiting as many folks, because they just have so many individuals that they are coming into contact with, that they're engaging with, that they're adding to their project, within HMIS. So they're entering a lot of folks into their project. And then just because the caseload is quite huge, and this is just the folks that they're conducting engagement with rather than ongoing intensive case management, perhaps those exits are not being completed.
What year did street outreach start?
We've had multiple iterations. The first, I believe, was around 2015 or so. I think another thing around this kind of period in through here is we have to also remember that that would be during the time frame of COVID, and so there would have been less inflow to shelters. That would have been a little bit harder for people to move into shelter or to get housed because of the eviction moratorium. Those that did go into, that were in shelter, probably would have had something like a COVID-funded emergency temporary shelter. So I think a lot of it has to do with Marissa pointing out how few exits there were for the program. A lot of us weren't moving anywhere during that time frame.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
Yeah, and I know, like, for example, not to call you out, but Erica, I know that you spent a majority or a huge chunk of last year exiting folks from street outreach that were just sitting in the project, for example. So I think that that has something to do with it, and because our street outreach project is very specific in that it's not like a rapid rehousing project or a permanent supportive housing project where you're engaging with those clients regularly, you're making a plan with them. Somebody from street outreach could not have engagement with somebody for 85 days, and then on day 90 they have an engagement with them again. So they've remained within that project, even if it's not a true indication of exactly how long they've been having routine and consistent communication with them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's what made me think first. Do you all look at how many exits are due to the unknown exit location, that they just kind of disappear and they don't know what happened to them?
Right. And typically what we try to do is we try to make that exit rather than unknown, disappeared, we try to make that exit a return to homelessness, because realistically that's probably what it is. And within HUD's classification of all of these exit destinations, unknown disappeared is seen as a non-destination because it's unknown.
That's what I was wondering.
Versus the reality, which is probably going to be a return to a place not meant for human habitation. And even though that's not, obviously that's not good, that's not a positive, it's still considered a location rather than unknown, which is just a blank, a
That's
question mark.
good to know, because I just exited a bunch of people unknown the other day, and now I feel bad. But
I did the same thing, and then I was like, okay, place not meant for habitation.
And I'm happy to help you through maybe fixing those.
that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm like, oh Jesus. Yeah, I did. I exited a ton of people.
So this is going to be our only measure within this measure 7, our only group that is going to have that positive destination of temporary and some institutional stays as well. Because as we move on to measure B1, this is looking at emergency shelter, transitional housing, plus other permanent housing projects other than PSH. So this is including rapid rehousing. Part of that is because rapid rehousing you have to exit versus permanent supportive housing, which is also looking at retention of. So of the above, those who exited to a permanent housing destination, we saw a decrease of 2%, and a decrease of those who also exited, respectively. And then looking at 7B2, this is looking at those permanent supportive housing because it's also examining retention, which is why you'll see that number so high in comparison to our 10%. At 98%, this is an increase of 5%, which is great. And it shows that our permanent supportive housing projects are successful because 98% of them are folks are continuing to remain housed or they're exiting to a permanent housing destination. So this is our folks who are in emergency shelter, transitional housing, and permanent housing, rapid rehousing projects who exit to a permanent housing destination. Again, just looking at the successful exits, looking over here, we have 22%, 23% is the highest in 2020 to 10% currently. So we have seen a nominal decrease. Again, this is just looking at 23 as the highest and 10% as our lowest. So still a decrease versus our change in permanent housing. So this is our permanent supportive housing, and you should be mindful that our bottom row here is 90 to 100. So even though it looks like it's doing a whole bunch, it is moving from 96 to 95 to 98 to 92 to 98 once more. So staying above 90%, it has remained very successful. Yeah. Any questions? Comments, concerns?
How much do you enjoy making those graphs? They crack me.
I love
can
graphs.
tell.
I can say you're a pretty good.
They're so colorful.
I love data.
I was going to say I could frame something. But
That was really helpful.
Besides complimenting me in my work, any other questions or concerns? I think one of the biggest takeaways that I had with looking at this data was primarily the returns to homelessness increasing so much within 6 months. I know we talked a little bit at length at that, but also just the success that we have with permanent supportive housing in comparison to emergency shelter, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing. The success rates of our PSH projects in comparison, I think, really speaks to just how valuable it is to have those ongoing, really intensive supportive services.
So just to clarify, because I was looking at the bottom, this is all the data you got was from HMIS?
Yes, that's right.
And how do you just take your county and just kind of do a breakout?
Yeah, so WellSky, which is our HMIS vendor, they have created this this report for us, the report that was in your packet, which is why it looks like it's printed out. So they created that report for us, and it is just looking at our continuum, so Lexington, Fayette County.
Oh, the reason I ask is I just literally last week started classes to learn the HMIS system. So, but I will be not just doing Fayette County, but all of 17 counties that we covered.
Yeah.
But I just want to make sure, because that's it could be helpful, you know, because I work within Fayette County, I could also include those numbers as well, so.
Yeah, and the balance of state, they also, yeah, they run this.
Yeah. So I'm learning. Teach an old dog new tricks.
Anything else? Then I will turn this off, and I think that I am next still.
Yep.
So, give me a minute. Okay, so our housing triage system updates, even though the first quarter of the calendar year is over, at the time that we created this packet and sent it out to you all, it had not yet been over. So because of that, the first quarter data concerning housing triage and the report that is associated with that will be available next meeting for everyone. But within those housing triage meetings, coordinated entry meetings that we have, we've currently, I know at our last meeting we discussed our coordinated entry assessment working draft that's gone back to our housing triage meeting with the feedback that was provided, so thank you all. I know that a lot of you were here for that meeting and provided really great feedback, so thank you so much. We finished that draft, and so the next steps are going to be engaging those with lived expertise and then our victim service providers for that language, and then thereafter expanding upon our initial assessment for individuals to then create a sub-assessment building on the work that we've already done for families and for youth. So be expecting if you have population, you serve a population with family with minors or youth 18 to 24 and unaccompanied adults, be on the lookout for some communication with me, because those will probably be more of a Zoom or in-person discussion of additional questions that need to be added to that. So I expect at our next meeting to have at least that initial draft to be voted on, and that assessment will just be for those who are individuals over the age of 25. Any questions? Okay, then I will keep talking. And some HMIS training announcements. Our next new user training is happening 1 week from tomorrow. Those happen 9 a.m. to noon. So if you need any additional folks who need to be trained in HMIS, that will be with myself and B. Please let us know. The one thereafter is going to be May 9th. So if maybe next week doesn't work for you, May 9th, it will be our one after. And our next end user group meeting, so this is for all folks who participate in HMIS and talking about one topic in particular during those meetings, and then having an open office hours for any discussion, any assistance that you may need in HMIS, or if you have an idea for what you would want to be discussed more thoroughly, please let me know. That next meeting will happen on May 14th from 2 to 3. Yeah.
Have you ever thought about doing like a refresher course HMIS training? Like not the complete training, but like just a refresher?
Like a 101?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think last year we did that, like we really narrowed in on like basic entry-exit workflow and households, but I'd be happy to kind of put that in our mind's eye for May 14th.
Yeah, just because I haven't had HMIS. I mean, I do a lot of HMIS, but I haven't had HMIS training in like probably 8 years. Like so, and every time someone goes through it, there's something new, and I'm like, I was like, I don't do it that way. Like, and so I would feel, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
And something that we've been talking about, those meetings, especially our in-user group meetings, they are recorded, and then I usually send out that recording for everyone to access thereafter via email. But something me and B had talked about was maybe a place for that to live, where you can access those recordings. And so we're currently thinking through, how can we make some of the training material that we provide for you all, that you may not be able to meet these meeting times. And rather than having to look through your email for when that occurred and find the link for that training, perhaps finding a place for those to live. So that's something that we've already been discussing, and hopefully we can execute.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm already learning the U-Learn classes that they give. Is that the system that they talk about on those classes are very different than the client serve. Because when I go to take classes, I'm like, wait a minute, this looks nothing like what they just taught me. So you kind of have, so I am now down to printing out 36 of the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation, so I can kind of thumb through and go, oh, yeah.
Well, as you're continuing to go through HMAS training with the balance of state, if there's anything that you find particularly helpful, please let us know.
I will definitely do that. But see, like I said, I've never done it before, so I have no idea what I'm even looking at, except the classes are slightly different than the way they have this website, the W website set up. So.
Other issues or public sharing? I think data put us into a coma. If there are no other announcements or public sharing, our next meeting of this committee will take place on Wednesday, June 5th, same room. And if there's nothing else, then we'd be ready to adjourn. Anyone want to take up the Bruce hat and give us a motion to adjourn?
I will be Bruce.